Out here on this road in the dark, I am the law, and I say you don't move until I tell you to move." The words came out of Sergeant Derek Voss's mouth, the way a man speaks when he has never once been told he was wrong. Slow and certain and almost bored, the way you'd read a grocery list or give directions to someone you didn't particularly want to help. And Diana Cole stood with her palms pressed flat against the cold metal roof of her own car and said nothing because she had spent 20 years learning exactly when silence was the most powerful thing a person could carry. The red and blue lights strobed across the oak trees lining Maple Street, painting everything in sharp, ugly intervals of color, and through the passenger window, Diana could see her mother. Ruth Cole, 71 years old, sitting very still, with both hands raised above the dashboard. The wooden cane she needed to walk, lying somewhere in the footwell where it had fallen, and Ruth's silver cross necklace catching the light every few seconds, like a small patient signal. But that evening had started the way all good evenings start, quietly without warning, with cornbread and her mother's laugh. The Magnolia Rose Cafe sat on the east side of Richmond, Virginia, in a narrow building that smelled permanently of brown butter and cast iron and something sweet baking somewhere in the back that you could never quite identify but always made you feel the moment you walked through the door that someone had been expecting you and had started cooking before you arrived. It was the kind of restaurant that didn't try very hard to be anything other than what it was. Low-lighting mismatched chairs, mason jar candles on every table, throwing warm, uneven light across white tablecloths that had been washed so many times the cotton had gone soft as flannel, and a small speaker mounted near the kitchen door playing gospel at a volume that asked nothing of you, just offered itself in case you needed it. Diana had reserved the corner table, the one closest to the window, because Ruth liked to watch the street while she ate, liked to comment on the cars and the dog walkers, and the occasional couple arguing outside the dry cleaner across the way. And tonight was Ruth's 71st birthday, and Diana had driven 2 hours from her apartment in Alexandria to be here, and she would have driven 4. Ruth Cole was not a woman you described easily because the things that made her who she was didn't sit still long enough to be pinned down. She was the kind of woman who tilted her whole head when something struck her as genuinely funny. Not just a polite smile, but a full tilt. Glasses slightly fogged. One hand coming up to cover her mouth too late, the laugh already out, and she still called every young man she encountered baby with a complete absence of irony, and she carried peppermint candies in her purse at all times because she said children in waiting rooms needed something to hold on to, and she believed this with the same practical certainty that she believed in paying bills on time and keeping your word. Her wooden cane was hooked over the back of her chair, and her silver cross necklace, the one Diana's father had given her the year Diana was born. The one Ruth had worn every single day since his funeral 11 years ago, caught the candlelight every time Ruth moved a small, steady gleam against the dark fabric of her dress. Tonight, Ruth was telling a story about the waiter, a tall young man with a gap between his front teeth who had brought the dessert menu and called her beautiful. And Ruth had decided with the absolute conviction of a woman who has earned the right to believe what she wants, that he had meant every syllable. Mama Diana said he was being polite. Ruth tilted her head at a 45-degree angle and looked at her daughter the way she had looked at students who turned in wrong answers with too much confidence. "That boy winked at me twice, Diana. Twice. Polite doesn't wink twice." Diana shook her head and cut a piece of sweet potato pie and slid it across the table, and Ruth swatted her hand away and pulled the whole plate closer without even glancing down, because Ruth Cole had been claiming the entire dessert for herself on her birthday since 1987, and she saw no reason to change the tradition now. This was peace. This was an entire evening contained in a small warm room with gospel playing softly and a mother stealing pie across a white tablecloth. You would not know watching Diana in that moment. Slacks and a blouse, reading glasses tucked into her collar. No title, no robes, no security detail that she had been confirmed 3 weeks earlier as a federal district court judge for the Eastern District of Virginia, one of the youngest black female federal judges in the history of the state. The result of 20 years of work that had started in a public defender's office in Norfolk taking the cases. No one else wanted drug possession and petty theft. and kids who reminded her of every boy she had grown up with. And then a decade in civil rights litigation documenting police brutality and wrongful arrest and racial profiling, not as headlines, but as the lived reality of people whose hands she had actually held. And then the appellate court, and then the call from Washington that she had not entirely believed was real until she was already on the phone saying yes. But that evening, none of that lived at the table with them. She had left it in the briefcase on the floor beneath her chair, deliberately the way you take off a coat when you come inside. She reached down once during the meal to check that the briefcase was still there, an unconscious habit, and her fingers found the worn leather handle, and she set it further back under her chair out of sight because tonight the only thing she was carrying was her mother's birthday. Ruth finishing the last of the sweet potato pie with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had won something, reached into her purse and drew out a small folded card. A prayer card from Sunday service 3 days ago, and read it once more to herself with her lips moving very slightly, and then tucked it carefully back into the side pocket of her purse beside the peppermints. A small private ritual that Diana had watched her perform 100 times the way some people reread a letter they've already memorized just to feel the weight of it again. The waiter came with the check. He called Ruth beautiful again on the way back to the kitchen. Ruth looked at Diana with an expression of pure, unassailable vindication. They walked out into the cool October air together, the restaurant door swinging shut behind them and cutting off the gospel and the warmth in one clean motion, and the street received them with the smell of distant wood smoke from someone's fireplace and the sound of crickets doing their patient work in the hedges along the sidewalk. Diana held her mother's arm as Ruth navigated the shallow curb, the cane finding the ground first, then the foot, then the slow, steady weight of a woman who had learned over the years to trust the pauses between steps, and Diana matched her pace without being asked, the way you do when you have watched someone you love learn a new way of moving through the world. She helped Ruth into the passenger seat, buckled her seatbelt, closed the door gently, and walked around to the driver's side, and before she opened her own door, she crouched briefly at the rear of the car and checked the taillights, both glowing a clean, steady red, a habit so ingrained she barely registered doing it. A habit built over 15 years of representing clients who had been pulled over for equipment violations that the equipment itself had not committed. Broken taillights that weren't broken, expired registration on plates that were current, small invented reasons that fit neatly into a report and disappeared just as neatly into a file that no one would ever fully examine. She got in, started the engine, placed the briefcase in the back seat, and pulled out of the parking lot. Ruth had her head resting against the window before they reached the first intersection, eyes half closed, humming along to the gospel Diana had found on the radio, low volume, and the dashboard glowed a warm amber in the dark. And the road ahead was nearly empty, and they were heading toward Whitmore Heights, where Ruth had lived for going on 14 years in the house with the magnolia tree in the front yard that bloomed every April, whether or not anyone remembered to water it. Whitmore Heights was the kind of neighborhood where the lawns were edged on both sides, and the American flags on the porches were replaced the moment they began to fade, where people waved at neighbors they recognized and locked their doors immediately after a stranger walked by, where the streets were quiet enough after 9 o'clock that you could hear the automatic sprinklers kicking on down the block, and where a silver sedan driven by a black woman had apparently looked to at least one set of eyes, like something that required an explanation. Diana changed lanes, and the headlights changed lanes behind her, and she thought probably nothing. She signaled a turn. The headlights followed. Her hands moved to 10 and 2 on the wheel, and she did not look away from the road. There is a specific kind of vigilance that gets passed down in black families, not through formal instruction but through repetition and consequence. A knowledge carried in the body rather than the mind. And Diana Cole had received her portion of it, the way most people receive it, not all at once, not with explanation, but incrementally through accumulated small moments that added up over time to a complete education in how to move through certain spaces without making yourself a reason. She had checked her taillights that morning, both of them red and solid, the same way she had checked them every morning for the last 15 years, and she was driving under the speed limit, and her registration was current, and her insurance card was in the glove compartment where it always lived, and there was no reason that the law recognized for the car behind her to be doing what it was doing. She changed lanes once more, smoothly, signaling first, and the headlights followed, and Ruth opened one eye fully and looked in the passenger side mirror and said in the tone of a woman who has seen this particular play performed before, "Somebody's following us, baby." "It's probably nothing," Mama Diana said, and her voice was level, and her face was calm, and her hands were at 10 and 2. And the thing about that grip, the thing no driving instructor had ever told her, was that it was not a technique for control of the steering wheel, but a technique for control of the self. A way of keeping the body organized around a center point when the world outside the windshield was preparing to become unreasonable. She had represented 231 clients over the course of her career whose stories had begun exactly this way: an evening drive of rearview mirror headlights, keeping pace with a patience that had nothing to do with traffic. The blue lights came on without warning, flooding the mirror with color, and Diana's stomach dropped, not from guilt because she had done nothing wrong, and she knew it with the certainty of someone who had just spent 15 minutes mentally cataloging every possible legitimate reason for a traffic stop and come up empty, but from the recognition of a pattern she had spent 20 years watching play out in other people's lives, and now here it was arriving in her own. She pulled to the right shoulder of Maple Street, slow and smooth, tires crunching on the gravel engine off both hands returned immediately to the steering wheel, 10 and 2. And she waited, and the blue lights kept spinning in the mirror, painting the inside of the car in cold, rhythmic flashes. "Stay still, Mama," she said. "Don't say anything unless he talks to you directly. Keep your hands where he can see them." Ruth sat up straight and folded her hands in her lap, and the silver cross at her throat caught the blue light and held it for a moment, and then the patrol car door opened. Sergeant Derek Voss had been with the Whitmore Heights Police Department for 17 years, long enough that the commendations on his office wall had started to overlap. Long enough that his name appeared in the complaint log with a regularity that certain sergeants at the precinct had quietly taken to calling a pattern, though never in writing and never in a room with witnesses, because the complaints, 11 in 6 years, every single one filed by a Black or Latino resident, every single one involving a traffic stop or a public space confrontation, had been reviewed and dismissed with a thoroughness that required effort, and 2 of those dismissals bore the initials of Chief Leonard Parks in the margin of the file, a small bureaucratic fact that was about to become considerably less small. He was broad-shouldered and fair-haired, with the kind of physical presence that fills a doorway, the way weather fills a room, not because of anything specific he did, but because of something in the quality of his attention, the way he directed it at a thing with the absolute certainty that the thing would yield. And when he stepped out of the patrol car on Maple Street that Wednesday evening, he did not walk to the silver sedan the way an officer approaches a routine stop, which is to say with procedural neutrality, but the way a man walks into a space he has already decided belongs to him. Chest forward, chin up, one hand resting near his holster with the ease of long habit boots on the gravel, slow and deliberate each step landing like a small announcement. He reached the driver's window and shone his flashlight directly into Diana's face, not at the dashboard, not at the back seat, not at the rear of the vehicle in the direction of the taillight. He would later claim was broken directly into her eyes, and held the beam there, bright and blinding and white, and Diana squinted, but did not flinch and did not look away, and then the beam swung to Ruth and held there, and Ruth raised one hand to shield her face, the silver cross catching the flashlight beam and scattering it briefly before the shadow of Ruth's hand came up and the bracelets on Ruth's wrist clinked softly against each other in the silence. Voss did not say good evening, did not introduce himself, did not explain the reason for the stop. License and registration, he said, and the 3 words came out flat and cold and final, delivered with the tone of someone who has already decided that the person receiving them will need to be reminded of their position. "Of course, Officer," Diana said, and her voice was the voice she used in courtrooms when she wanted a jury to understand that she was not rattled. calm and clear and carrying no excess weight whatsoever. "May I reach into my purse?" Voss looked at her for a moment. "License and registration," he said again without variation. She moved slowly, both hands visible at every stage, opened her purse, extracted her wallet, pulled the license and the registration, and handed them through the window, and Voss took them without looking at her face, and held the license up to his flashlight and studied the photograph, and then looked back at Diana, the way a person looks at two things they believe should not match. "This your car," he said. "Yes, sir." "Where'd you get it?" The question landed in the air between them and stayed there. A second patrol car pulled up behind the first, and Officer Pete Garza stepped out, 28 years old, 18 months on the force. Moving with the slightly too eager energy of a newer officer arriving at a situation he hasn't fully read yet. And he came to stand beside Voss and looked at the silver sedan and at the woman behind the wheel and at Voss's face, and something in what he saw there made him slow down just slightly, though not enough, not yet, to actually stop. The questions Voss asked over the next several minutes had nothing to do with traffic law and everything to do with a theory he had already formed before he finished crossing the gravel. A theory about who Diana Cole was and what she was doing on this road in this neighborhood at this hour. And the questions followed the logic of that theory with the tidy internal consistency of something that has been practiced enough times to feel to the person asking like instinct. "Where are you coming from? And what were you doing there? And is there anyone who can confirm that? And where exactly are you headed? And does she actually live there in Whitmore Heights?" Diana answered every question with the same level precision she brought to cross-examination, which is to say that she gave the accurate answer, and only the accurate answer, and did not elaborate beyond what was asked, because she had learned in 20 years of legal work that elaboration in a hostile conversation is an invitation, and she was not in the business of offering invitations to Derek Voss. What infuriated him, and it was clear from the way his jaw tightened and the way he rolled his weight forward onto the balls of his feet, that it infuriated him, was not her answers, but the quality of her delivery, the complete absence of the fear. He expected the composure that refused to crack. No matter how close he stood, or how flat he kept his voice as though she were somewhere cooler and quieter inside herself than the situation seemed to warrant, and that composure read to him not as dignity, but as defiance, which told you more about Derek Voss than it told you about Diana Cole. He told her there was a broken tail light, which was the reason for the stop, and Diana knew with the absolute factual certainty of a woman who had crouched at the rear of her own car that morning and confirmed both lights burning clean and red that this was not true. And she stored the information the way she stored all useful information, quietly, precisely, without showing that she had stored it. Ruth's voice came softly from the passenger seat, not aggressive, just a mother who had been watching long enough. "She hasn't done anything wrong, officer. We're just trying to get home." Voss swung his flashlight beam to the passenger window without turning his body, and said without particular heat, but with a complete absence of anything resembling courtesy, "Old lady, I'm not talking to you. Keep quiet." The word "old lady," the particular way he said it, not descriptive, but dismissive, as though Ruth Cole were an inconvenient piece of furniture, landed on Pete Garza's face like something small and sharp, and Garza looked briefly at the ground and then back at Voss, and did not speak. Diana was told to step out of the vehicle. She opened the door slowly, both hands visible and forward the entire time, and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder of Maple Street in the October air, and the night received her with the smell of wood smoke from someone's distant fireplace, and the sound of the blue lights cycling steadily against the oak trees, and the particular quality of silence that settles over a street when something is happening that the street is pretending not to notice. "Hands on the vehicle," Voss said. Diana placed her palms flat on the roof of her own car, and the metal was cold and faintly vibrating with the residual warmth of the engine ticking down, and the red and blue strobes painted her shadow across the pavement in sharp, repeating intervals. And she stood that way and waited. Across the street, a porch light had come on while they were still talking, and a man in a dark bathrobe stood in the doorway with his arms folded, watching the scene with the blank attentiveness of someone watching evening television present, but uninvested. And next door, a set of blinds parted briefly and then fell closed again, and a car came down Maple Street from the far end, slowed slightly as it passed the flashing lights, and then accelerated away. And nobody came forward, and nobody called out, and nobody walked across the street to ask if everything was all right, and the neighborhood kept its silence with the practiced ease of a place that had learned long ago that certain things were best observed from a careful distance. Voss told Garza to keep an eye on the passenger. The old lady don't let her reach for nothing, and Garza walked around to the passenger side and tapped his flashlight against the window, and Ruth looked up at him, her face carrying the specific expression of a woman who had been frightened and was working hard not to show it, and Garza told her to keep her hands where he could see them, and Ruth raised both hands, and the wooden cane she had been holding slipped from her grip and fell into the footwell with a hollow, clumsy sound, and Ruth sat with her palms open and her fingers shaking, and did not reach down to pick up the cane, because she was afraid to move, and the silver cross at her throat caught the light, and caught the light, and caught the light in the darkness. Diana could see her mother's hands through the car window raised, trembling, the bracelet sliding down her wrists, and she did not look away. Voss walked a slow circuit around the car before beginning the search. The deliberate circumnavigation of a man who wants you to understand that your time is his to spend. And when he reached the rear of the vehicle, he crouched and directed his flashlight at the taillights. Both of them, and held the beam there for a long and unhurried moment, and both lights glowed back at him steady and red and fully functional. No flicker, no crack, no ambiguity whatsoever. And Voss stayed crouched for several more seconds than was necessary, and then he stood up and adjusted his belt and walked back toward Diana as though he had seen exactly what he expected to see, and it had confirmed exactly what he already knew. And he said nothing about the tail lights, not a word, not an acknowledgement that the reason he had given for the stop had just visibly failed to materialize because men like Derek Voss do not revise their narratives based on evidence. They simply proceed to the next chapter and trust that no one will look back. He stopped close enough that Diana could smell the stale coffee on his breath and the particular cheap astringency of drugstore aftershave, and he leaned in slightly, dropping his voice to the register men use when they want you to feel the proximity of their authority. And he said, "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to search this vehicle. You're going to stand right there and keep your mouth shut while I do it. We clear. I do not consent to a search of my vehicle," Diana said. Voss smiled, and the smile traveled no further north than the middle of his face. "Wasn't asking for your consent, sweetheart." He turned back toward Garza, then his voice shifting to the casual register of a man talking to a colleague rather than a suspect, carrying the particular ease of someone who has done this many times in front of many witnesses and has never once been asked to account for it. And he said loudly enough specifically, and deliberately loudly enough that Diana could hear every word. "These people always carry papers like it means something. Like a fancy car and a briefcase makes you somebody. Makes you belong somewhere." Garza said nothing. Diana said nothing. She stood with her palms flat on the cold metal roof of her own car, and she filed the sentence away in the part of her mind where she kept things that would be needed later. The part that had been filling up patiently and methodically since the moment the blue lights first appeared in her rearview mirror, and she waited. Voss popped the trunk without asking. The release lever was in the door, and he found it without hesitation, the casual fluency of a man who has searched enough cars that the geography of them has become automatic, and the trunk light flickered on over the contents, a spare tire in its well, a small first aid kit in a red zip pouch, a reusable grocery bag from a hardware store folded flat in the corner. He stared into the trunk for a long moment as if waiting for something incriminating to materialize out of the ordinariness of what was there, and then he slammed it shut with both hands, and the whole car rocked forward from the impact, and Ruth flinched hard in the passenger seat, and Garza, standing at the passenger window, watched Ruth flinch and looked briefly at his own hands. Voss opened the rear door and reached in without ceremony and picked up Ruth's purse, small brown leather worn at the clasp, and turned it upside down over the back seat. Everything fell out at once, a tube of lipstick that rolled to the far edge of the seat, Ruth's folding reading glasses in their soft case, a travel pack of tissues, a small leather-bound Bible with a broken spine from years of being opened at the same passages, a loose handful of peppermint candies that scattered across the leather, and the prayer card, the one Ruth had read at the end of dinner, and tucked carefully back into the side pocket of her purse, slid off the edge of the seat and landed face down on the gravel outside the door, and Voss stepped forward to reach deeper into the car, and his boot came down on the prayer card without him looking, without him knowing, without it meaning anything to him at all. The birthday cake box was on the floor of the back seat, white cardboard, a small red bow on top, Ruth's leftover slice of birthday cake inside, and Voss picked it up, flipped the lid open, looked at the single piece of frosted vanilla cake inside with the expression of a man who has opened enough boxes in enough cars to have made his peace with the tedium of finding nothing, and dropped it back onto the seat, and a smear of white frosting transferred to the leather where the box landed crooked. Sarge Garza said quietly from the other side of the car, "There's nothing here." Voss did not acknowledge him. He reached for the briefcase. Diana's leather briefcase was 14 years old, and it showed every one of them the handles darkened from use, the corners worn through to the raw material beneath the finish, the zipper pull replaced twice, and it had been in every courtroom she had ever entered, had sat on counsel tables from Norfolk to Alexandria to the Fourth Circuit in Richmond, and it went everywhere she went because the work went everywhere she went, and tonight it was sitting upright on the back seat of her car, containing, among other things, her federal judicial appointment letter signed by the President of the United States, her official court credentials and identification badge for the Eastern District Courthouse, her formal invitation to her own investiture ceremony, and a legal pad with notes from a case she had been reviewing that afternoon. Voss grabbed the briefcase by the handle and unzipped it with the single sharp motion of a man who expects zippers to cooperate with him, and they did, and the briefcase fell open across his arm. Legal pads, manila folders, a stack of printed documents held together with a binder clip, a blue pen tucked into the interior elastic loop, and on top of everything, lying flat and immediately visible the moment the zipper cleared, a cream-colored envelope. Heavy stock, the kind of envelope that announces its own importance through weight and texture alone, and embossed in the upper left corner with the seal of the United States District Court, Eastern District of Virginia. Voss picked up the envelope. He held it up to his flashlight, and the beam passed through the heavy paper and illuminated the dark shape of the document inside the dense official language, and clearly visible against the light, the darker oval of the presidential seal pressed into the paper. He read the return address. Office of the United States District Court, Eastern District of Virginia. He held the envelope for 4 full seconds, which is long enough to read the return address, twice long enough to feel the weight of the paper, long enough to recognize that what you are holding was not put into this briefcase casually or accidentally, but with the deliberate care of someone for whom it represents something significant. The thought that crossed his mind in those 4 seconds, and this is not speculation, but the kind of thing that becomes known when men like Derek Voss sit across from federal prosecutors and are asked to account for every moment of a recorded evening, was something close to lawyers carry papers, like papers make them somebody, and fancy envelopes don't change what I already know about who this woman is and why she is driving through this neighborhood at this hour. He shoved the envelope back into the briefcase. He zipped it shut. He lifted the briefcase, Diana Cole's briefcase, the one that had just been in his hands, the one containing the signed letter from the President of the United States, confirming Diana Cole as a federal district court judge, the credentials and the badge and the invitation, and the 20 years of work that had produced all of them, and he dropped it onto the back seat of the car, the way you drop a bag of groceries you've been asked to carry for someone you didn't want to help. He did not open the envelope. He did not read the appointment letter inside. He did not look at the federal court identification badge clipped to the interior pocket. He had already decided who Diana Cole was, and no envelope was going to revise that decision. because revision required a kind of doubt that Derek Voss had long since stopped making room for. Diana watched every second of this from the roadside with her palms flat on the cold metal roof of her car, and her jaw tightened once a single small contraction of muscle and then released, and her hands stayed exactly where they were, and she said nothing. Garza watched too from the other side of the vehicle, and he was very still. Voss walked back to Diana with the tight jaw of a man who has searched an entire car and found nothing, and knows that this makes him look like something he refuses to be, which is wrong. And the anger that came off him was not the hot, immediate anger of someone who has been surprised, but the dense, smoldering anger of someone whose certainty has been inconvenienced without being dislodged, the kind of anger that requires a target to justify itself. He stopped, too close enough that Diana could see the small vein pulsing along his temple and feel the heat radiating off him and smell the coffee and the sweat. And he looked at her the way he had looked at the taillights, as though the absence of what he expected to find was itself suspicious. "You think you're pretty smart, don't you?" he said, and it was not a question. Sergeant Diana said, and her voice was steady and clean and carried the particular quality of attention that courtrooms produce in people who have spent years in them. The search found nothing. Both taillights are functional. You have no probable cause. What you are doing right now is unlawful detention, and I am asking you respectfully to let us go. Voss let out a short laugh, the kind that has no warmth anywhere in it. He glanced at Garza. "You hear that?" and then looked back at Diana and stepped forward one more inch, and his voice dropped to the register he had used on her earlier, the register that was meant to feel like a wall closing in. "Out here on this road in the dark," he said, "I am the law, and I say you don't move until I tell you to move." Ruth's voice came through the passenger window, thin but fierce. The voice of a 71-year-old woman who had spent 34 years in front of classrooms and was not without resources when it came to making herself heard. "She has not done a single thing wrong. We just want to go home. Please." Voss wheeled and pointed his flashlight at Ruth through the window like he was pointing something else. "One more word from you and you're coming too. You understand me? One more word." Ruth's mouth closed and her chin began to tremble, and 2 tears ran down her face, catching the blue strobe light in 2 quick silver lines, and she sat very still because she was afraid, and she was 71 years old, and it was her birthday. Diana watched her mother cry through the glass, and something happened in her chest that was not in any legal brief. She had ever written something that had no Latin name and no statute number. Something that moved through her like a slow, deep pressure and settled into the structure of her as something permanent and unforgiving and quietly decided. Her hands on the roof were shaking, and it was not from fear. "Sergeant," she said, and her voice was more careful now, more precise. The way a voice gets when the person using it is controlling something very large. "Both taillights are functional, which you have seen for yourself. Your search produced nothing, which you already know. You have no probable cause, which means this is unlawful detention. And I am asking you one more time to let us go." Voss tilted his head and smiled the dead-eyed smile and said, "Unlawful detention. Listen to her. You a lawyer now, I'm telling you what the law says. Let me tell you what the law says." He stepped so close she could feel his breath on her forehead, and his voice was very quiet and very certain. "Out here on this road in the dark, I am the law, and I say you stay." The handcuffs came with the click before the cold. The metal ratcheting shut around her wrists with the efficiency of a mechanism that does not require the person using it to feel anything in particular, and Diana did not fight, did not cry, did not raise her voice. And she looked at Voss one time before he turned her away from the car. Looked at him with a steadiness that had been built over 20 years and could not be taken apart in a single evening on the side of Maple Street. And she said quietly, so only he could hear it, "You're going to regret this. Not because of who I am, because of what you just did." And Voss leaned in and grinned and said, "Only thing I regret is not doing it sooner." Voss told Garza to get the passenger out of the car, and Garza looked at him for a moment, the way a younger person looks at an older person who has just asked them to do something they are not sure they can defend later. And then he walked to the passenger door and opened it, and Ruth looked up at him with her hands still raised, her face carrying the specific, exhausted dignity of a woman who has been frightened for a sustained period, and has decided that dignity is the one thing she is not giving up. "Ma'am, Garza said I need you to step out of the vehicle, please." Ruth reached for her cane, and her fingers found only the smooth interior of the door panel because the cane had fallen into the footwell, and she moved her hand lower, searching, and Garza watched her for a moment and then did something that cost him very little and meant a great deal. He bent down and picked up the cane and held it out to her gently without being asked, the way you would hand something to a person you respected. Ruth took it from him without speaking, without looking at him, and used it and the door frame together to pull herself upright, and her knees held barely, and she stepped down onto the gravel shoulder of Maple Street, and the night air met her face, and she was 71 years old, and it was her birthday, and she was standing on the side of a road she had driven past 100 times, having her purse emptied across the back seat of her daughter's car. "Search her," Voss said. Garza turned to look at him. "Sarge, she's 71. She has a cane. There's nothing I said search her. Do it or I will." Garza's hands, when he turned back to Ruth, were not entirely steady, and Ruth closed her eyes before his hands reached her, and her lips moved in a private, inward motion that had no sound attached to it. A prayer, or something close enough to prayer, that the difference didn't matter, and Garza ran his hands quickly along her sides, the fastest and most minimal version of what he had been ordered to do, and found nothing, because there was nothing, because Ruth Cole was a 71-year-old retired school principal on her birthday, and there was never going to be anything. "Nothing," Garza said. Of course, nothing, Voss said, already walking away. Diana had been watching every second of this from the other side of the car, and what it cost her to watch it, to stand with her hands restrained behind her, and watch a stranger's hands move along her mother's sides, while Ruth stood with her eyes closed and her lips moving on the gravel shoulder of Maple Street, illuminated by flashing lights on her birthday, was not something that could be quantified or adequately reported or fully communicated to another human being. But it was the kind of thing that becomes part of the permanent record of a life. The kind of thing that does not fade. The kind of thing that a person carries forward from that night into every morning that follows. Something broke in her in that moment, not loudly, not dramatically, not in any way that altered her posture or her expression or the controlled steadiness of her breathing, but it broke the way glass breaks underwater, silently, completely, with no announcement and no possibility of being unbroken. She was going to remember the sound of her mother's cane on the gravel. She was going to remember the silver cross catching the strobe light. She was going to remember every single word Derek Voss had said in the exact order he had said it for the rest of her life. Voss walked her to the back of the patrol car, opened the door, and she ducked in, and the door slammed behind her with a finality that had its own particular weight, the weight of a mechanism designed to separate, and the back seat received her with a hard plastic bench and a cage partition, and the stale, layered smell of other people's bad nights that no amount of industrial cleaner had ever fully resolved. Through the window, she could see her mother standing alone on the gravel shoulder, small against the dark trees. One hand on the cane, her chin still slightly raised with the effort of maintaining herself, and the birthday cake smeared on the back seat of Diana's car. And somewhere on the pavement, face down, Ruth's prayer card stepped on and lying in the dark where Voss had left it. Nobody had come forward. Nobody had crossed the street. Nobody on the tidy, flag-hung, lawn-edged block of Whitmore Heights had decided that what was happening on the shoulder of Maple Street was something they needed to involve themselves in. Diana sat very still on the hard bench and counted her breaths the way she counted during hostile cross-examination sessions when opposing counsel was working hard to find the edge of her composure, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Steady each breath, a small, deliberate act of self-possession, and she did not cry, and she did not shout against the cage partition, and she did not do any of the things that fear produces, because what she was feeling was not fear, and she was old enough and experienced enough to know the difference. In the front seat, Voss was humming. Not anxious humming, not the kind of humming a person does when they are trying to fill uncomfortable silence, but the loose, absent-minded humming of a man who is entirely at ease with himself and his evening. A man who has done the thing he came to do, and is now simply covering the distance between here and the next thing, and the humming had a cheerfulness to it that was more damning than anything he had said all night. Garza sat in the passenger seat without speaking, eyes forward, jaw set, not humming, not at ease, not filling any of his silence at all. A third officer had arrived while Diana was being put in the car, and he walked Ruth to a second vehicle, and Diana watched through the rear window as her mother moved slowly across the gravel, cane in hand, back straight the silver cross, a small point of light in the dark. And then the car turned and she couldn't see her anymore, and the only things visible through the window were the oak trees and the blue light cycling against them and a single square of yellow light from the porch across the street where the man in the bathrobe had gone inside and left the light on. Down the block, as Voss had noted with the mild satisfaction of a man who finds ordinary things affirming, an automatic sprinkler kicked on and began its patient ticking in the dark, completely indifferent to everything. The Whitmore Heights police station was a low concrete building on the far side of the neighborhood's commercial district, fluorescent lit and civic in the way that government buildings are. Civic, functional, unadorned, communicating through its architecture that it was not in the business of making anyone comfortable, and the American flag out front hung limp on its pole in the still October air, and the parking lot was smooth and empty and well-maintained, and the automatic doors opened when Voss walked Diana through them and closed again without any commentary. The two officers at the front desks looked up when Voss brought her in, and then looked back down at their paperwork with the practiced speed of people who have learned that certain things are better not observed too carefully, and the booking procedure moved forward with the bureaucratic efficiency of a process that has been repeated enough times to have smoothed itself into something close to frictionless. The fingerprint ink was cold and dense against Diana's fingers, pressing into the whorls of her fingertips with a thoroughness that felt in the moment like something being taken from her. A small theft being conducted by the machinery of the state, and the height chart on the cinder-block wall had a scuff mark at the 5-foot line from years of heels catching it, and the camera flash was sharp and white and clinical, and then the holding cell, which was at the end of a short hallway that smelled of industrial cleaner, and the particular staleness of recycled air metal bench, bolted to the concrete wall steel toilet without a seat, a fluorescent tube overhead that buzzed at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious annoyance, but well within the range of cumulative wearing down. The door clanged shut. The lock engaged with a sound that carried down the hallway and came back. Voss didn't look back. He walked directly to the break room, poured himself a cup of coffee, settled into a chair across from Officer Tom Briggs, who had just come off a double shift and was nursing his own coffee with the glazed patience of a man counting down to his bed. And Voss leaned back and grinned and said, "Evening special." Pulled a real mouthy one out of a sedan on Maple Street. Her and her mama driving through like they own the place, giving me attitude about probable cause. He took a long sip of coffee. Booked her for obstruction. She'll cool down in there. Briggs chuckled and shook his head in the way of a man responding to a familiar story. And the two of them sat in the break room under the fluorescent light, and the whole system that had built Derek Voss and protected him and sent him out into the streets with a badge for 17 years, sat in the room with them, visible in the ease of that laugh, the comfort of that shared coffee, the complete untroubled certainty that what had happened on Maple Street was ordinary and justified and would never be examined. Diana sat on the metal bench with her back straight and her hands folded on her knees, and the red marks from the handcuffs already settling into something darker, already becoming the bruises. They would be fully by morning, and the fluorescent light above her buzzed, and the smell of bleach in the cell was the smell of someone's effort to cover something that covering had not entirely resolved. She had one phone call. She did not call a lawyer. She did not call a colleague from her years in civil rights litigation who would know exactly what to do. She did not call her husband, who was in Charlotte at a conference, and would have gotten in his car immediately and driven through the night. She called Judge Raymond Alcott, senior judge on the Eastern District Bench, her mentor for 11 years, a man who had answered his phone at any hour for as long as she had known him, a man who had written 3 of the letters of recommendation that had accompanied her confirmation, a man who knew the difference between a phone call that needed sympathy and a phone call that needed action, and who could tell from the first word which kind this was. She said, "Raymond, it's Diana Cole. I apologize for calling so late." A pause. "Then I'm at the Whitmore Heights police station. I've been arrested on a charge of obstruction. There was no probable cause. My mother was with me. I need nothing except for you to know where I am." Alcott's reply after 4 seconds of silence was, "Don't say another word to anyone. I'm making calls right now." Diana hung up the phone on the wall, walked back to the metal bench, sat down, folded her hands in her lap over the darkening marks on her wrists, and waited. The fluorescent light flickered once, steadied, flickered again, and held. She did not look up. Diana could not hear the phone calls from inside the holding cell, and she did not need to because she had made enough legal calls in her life to know exactly what they sounded like on the receiving end, and what they produced in the people who received them. And what she could perceive from the metal bench at the end of the hallway was something more fundamental than sound. It was a change in pressure, the specific atmospheric shift of a building whose assumptions about itself are being revised in real time. The first call went to the United States Marshal's office, and the desk sergeant who answered it listened for approximately 45 seconds, and when he put the phone down, his face had the look of a man who has just been handed a document he is not sure he knows how to process. The second call reached the district attorney's office on the line that gets answered regardless of the hour, and whoever answered that one came out of the back office 15 seconds later and said something in a low voice to the sergeant, and the sergeant who had been sitting stood up. The third call, and this one, took 12 minutes to connect because it required going through a private number, and the private number required going through a home number, and the home number required explaining to a very patient housekeeper who was calling and why reached the governor's chief of staff. The sergeant's hands, when he set down his coffee cup, were not steady. Down the hall, Voss was still in the break room, currently performing his best version of the stop for a third colleague who had just come on duty, complete with the tone of a man telling a story he finds entertaining, and he had no awareness whatsoever of what was happening at the front desk, because certainty of that particular variety is self-sealing. It does not admit drafts. Pete Garza was sitting at a desk in the far corner of the main room with his jacket still on, and he had been looking at the surface of that desk for going on 30 minutes, and he had not gotten up to join the break room, and he had not gone to his car, and he had not spoken to anyone. And the thing he was looking at on the surface of that desk was not visible to anyone else in the room. Chief Leonard Parks arrived at the Whitmore Heights police station at 11:47 in the evening, and he had clearly come directly from his home without taking the time for anything beyond the most minimal preparation. His tie was crooked. His shirt was half untucked on the left side, and one of his shoes was tied and one was not, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has received information over the phone that his body has not yet finished processing. He did not stop at the front desk. He did not acknowledge the sergeant who stood up when he came through the door or the 2 officers who straightened in their chairs. He walked directly down the hallway toward the holding area with his shoes clicking unevenly on the linoleum, one heel striking louder than the other, and he stopped at the small glass window in the cell door and looked through it. Diana Cole was sitting on the metal bench with her back straight and her hands folded and her wrists bearing the red darkened marks that handcuffs leave when they are put on by someone who is not trying to be gentle. And her eyes were level, and her face was composed with the particular composure of a person who has decided to wait. And she looked exactly like what she was, which was a woman of complete and documented authority who was sitting in a cell where she had no legal or moral business being. Parks had shaken her hand at her confirmation celebration. He had congratulated her, Somebody had taken a photograph of the two of them standing together, and it was framed in his office because it was the kind of photograph that was good for an office, the chief of police, and the new federal judge, both smiling, both representing the best version of what the system was supposed to be. He turned from the window. Every cell in his face had emptied of its color. "Open this door," he said to the officer at the end of the hallway, and his voice cracked on the first word. "Right now. Open it." The key went in. The lock turned. The door swung open. Parks turned and faced the station floor, the desks, the clerks, the officers, the full-occupied room, and at some point in the last 30 seconds, Voss had come out of the break room drawn by the commotion and was standing near the break room doorway with his coffee cup in his hand and the expression of a man who has not yet understood that the commotion is about him. Parks straightened his back, and he swallowed once, and what he said next was not a statement about procedure or an announcement about the situation or a preliminary remark of any kind. It was simply the thing that the moment required delivered into the silence of a room that had gone completely still. "All rise for Judge Diana Cole." The coffee cup hit the linoleum, and the sound it made was the sound of something ending. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something larger than sound, the held-breath quality of a room in which 20 people have simultaneously understood something. They cannot immediately find words for, and into that silence, Derek Voss stood with his face the color of chalk, and his mouth open, and nothing coming out because his body had understood before his mind had what the name Diana Cole spoken in that building, in that context, by that voice actually meant. Diana stepped through the cell door with her back straight and her chin level and the marks from the handcuffs dark on her wrists, and she looked at Voss the way she had looked at hostile witnesses for 20 years, not with rage, not with the satisfaction of a person who has been proven right, but with the calm, absolute certainty of a woman who has simply been waiting for the right moment to arrive, and now it had, and she had nothing left to prove to anyone in this room. And Derek Voss could see that in her face, and the thing he saw there was worse for him than anger would have been. The officers rose one at a time, chair legs scraping the linoleum in irregular intervals, some quickly and some slowly, each one making the same private calculation and arriving at the same conclusion. And Pete Garza, standing at his desk in the far corner, rose first, and his eyes were wet, and he was looking at Diana with an expression that combined relief and shame in approximately equal measure. Derek Voss was the last to stand, and his legs, when they found him barely held, Diana said nothing. She didn't need to. Parks turned to Voss, and the distance he covered to reach him was the same distance Voss had covered to reach Diana on the side of Maple Street. The same pointed, deliberate proximity, and Parks's voice was quiet and very controlled, and left absolutely no room for anything. Badge and gun on the desk. Right now. Voss's hands were shaking badly enough that unhooking the holster took longer than it should have, and the gun came down on the counter with a clatter that was louder than Parks's voice had been, and then the badge Voss had worn for 17 years. The badge that had meant to Derek Voss something more than regulation required it to mean came down face first with a flat metallic sound, and it was over. "Suspended without pay, effective right now," Parks said. "Internal Affairs will be in touch. Go home. Don't speak to the press. Don't come back to this building until you hear from them." Voss opened his mouth, and what he tried to say was the thing men like Derek Voss always try to say in moments like this. "One chief I didn't know she was." Parks cut him off before the sentence finished. 5 words spoken quietly landed in the room with the weight of something that had needed saying for a long time. She shouldn't have had to. Voss closed his mouth, and it was the first time all evening that he had nothing left to say, and the silence that followed was the silence of a man finally running out of road. He was escorted to the door by 2 officers from his own break room. Briggs and the 3rd colleague he had been entertaining earlier, and neither one of them looked at him, and the automatic doors slid open, and the October night received him, and the doors slid closed behind him, and it was done. Parks turned to Diana, and his face was gray, and his voice was doing its best not to break entirely, and he began Judge Cole on behalf of this department. I can't, and he stopped because there was no sentence available to him that was adequate to what had happened, and he seemed to understand that. Diana raised one hand, the right hand, the wrist still marked, and stopped him. "Where is my mother?" she said. Parks said an officer had driven Ruth home. She was safe. "Did she have her cane?" Parks turned to the desk sergeant, and the desk sergeant checked and came back with, "Yes, ma'am, she has her cane." Diana nodded, and then she looked out across the room, and every officer and clerk and uniform in the Whitmore Heights police station was looking back at her. And she spoke without raising her voice, because she had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. And what she said was not a speech, and not a lecture, and not a performance. It was a statement of fact, delivered by a woman who had been standing in a field of facts all evening, patient and thorough. She named the complaint file. She noted the number of complaints 11 in 6 years, and the demographic pattern, every single complainant Black or Latino, and the outcome, every single complaint reviewed and dismissed. She noted that 2 of those dismissals carried Parks' initials. She did not accuse him. She did not editorialize. She simply described what the record showed the way she had described records in courtrooms for 20 years, and let the record speak for itself. "This isn't one bad night on a road in Whitmore Heights," she said. "This is what happens when a pattern is allowed to become comfortable. We both know it." Parks had nothing to say. She turned to Garza, who was standing near the back wall with his arms at his sides and the look of a man standing at the edge of something very deep, and she spoke to him with the specific directness she reserved for people she believed were capable of better than what they had done. "You were there for all of it. You watched my 71-year-old mother get pulled out of a car and searched on the side of the road on her birthday. You knew it was wrong." Garza's chin dropped. "Yes, ma'am. There will be an investigation. You can tell the truth now, or you can tell it under oath later. I recommend now." Garza nodded slowly, the nod of a man making a decision that he should have made hours ago. "I'll cooperate fully, Your Honor. I'm sorry. I should have stopped it." Diana looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "You should have." She turned and walked toward the exit, her shoes steady and deliberate on the linoleum, and every person she passed either held very still or looked at the floor. And one young female officer near the front desk was crying quietly into the back of her hand, and did not try to conceal it, and Diana did not stop, because there was nothing in this building she needed from anyone in it. She pushed through the front doors into the October night, cool and clean, the smell of damp asphalt and something that might have been rain coming from the direction of the river, and she stopped on the sidewalk and closed her eyes and drew one long breath in and held it and let it go. And the night air tasted like the end of something and the beginning of something else, and she stood there for a moment taking the measure of both. Then she took out her phone and called her mother. "Mama," she said, "I'm coming home. We're okay." On the other end, Ruth was crying too hard to say anything back, but she was home and she was safe, and the cane was beside her chair, and that was enough for right now. That was more than enough. The neighbor from the third house down on the far side of Maple Street, a retired postal worker named Howard Eames, who had been standing on his porch in a dark bathrobe watching the entire stop with his phone recording, because, as he told Nadine Cross of the Richmond Herald later, he had a granddaughter who was 14, and he had already decided that when something happened in front of him, he was going to document it. Uploaded the footage to his social media accounts at 7:15 the following morning. No filter, no commentary, no caption beyond the address and the date. The footage spread in the way that footage spreads when it contains something that people cannot look at once and turn away from you, could hear everything, every word Voss said. The handcuffs Ruth crying on the curb, the birthday cake box landing on the smeared leather, and Diana, throughout all of it, completely still composed her palms flat on the roof of her own car, while her 71-year-old mother stood alone on the gravel with her cane and her silver cross and her shaking hands. Diana's habit camera. The small recording device she had clipped to her bag for 14 years without ever once needing it as much as she needed it. That night provided the second angle closer, more intimate, capturing the exact quality of Voss's face when he said, "I am the law," and his hands on the briefcase, and the cream-colored envelope held up in the flashlight beam and then shoved back and thrown aside, and the words, "These people always carry papers like it means something," in Voss's own voice, precise and unambiguous. 2 cameras, 1 truth, and Nadine Cross. Cross had covered police misconduct in Virginia for 11 years, and she recognized immediately when she saw the footage that what she was looking at was not a single incident, but the visible surface of something that had been building underground for a long time. And she filed a public records request for Voss's complete personnel file before 9 o'clock that morning, and what came back was a document that took her 2 hours to read, and left her sitting very still at her desk afterward. 11 complaints, 6 years. Every complainant, black or Latino, every complaint dismissed an internal affairs unit that had become functionally a complaint disappearing machine and scattered through the dismissal records Parks's initials. She published her first story on a Thursday, front page. The headline was "Multiple Complaints, Zero Consequences." The federal charges came in 4 counts: unlawful detention, civil rights violation under federal statute, filing a false police report, and abuse of authority. The evidence was comprehensive enough that Voss's attorney spent most of the trial trying to establish that his client had followed procedure, a defense that required not addressing the footage, which was difficult since the footage showed both taillights burning clearly red and Voss's hand on the briefcase, and the words "these people" in his own voice, which the prosecution played at normal volume in a quiet federal courtroom. Garza testified on a Tuesday afternoon quietly, steadily, with his eyes on the floor and his voice level, and he told the truth that Voss had said before the stop, that the car didn't belong in this neighborhood, that the probable cause had been invented, that there had not been a broken tail light, that Garza had known from the first minute that what was happening was wrong and that he had not stopped it. The prosecution's closing argument was 5 sentences long. The last sentence was, she shouldn't have had to tell him who she was. None of them should. The jury was gone for 3 hours. Guilty. All 4 counts. Sentencing 36 months federal. Lifetime ban from law enforcement anywhere in the United States. His name entered permanently into the National Decertification Index, which meant that no badge, no uniform, no authority of any kind was available to Derek Voss for the remainder of his life. The federal courthouse in Richmond had been built in 1934, and it had the specific gravity of a building that has absorbed a great many moments over a long period of time. The marble floors worn smooth in the paths that lawyers and clerks and witnesses had been walking for 90 years. The dark wood paneling of the courtroom holding within its grain some residual quality of every proceeding that had ever taken place within it, the smell of old leather and polished brass, and the particular dryness of climate-controlled air preserving important things. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and there were people standing along the back wall who had arrived early enough to claim their spot, and then stayed very still so as not to lose it. And the cameras from 3 networks were set up on the steps outside, and in the gallery itself there were young attorneys, black and brown and white, the newest generation of the profession people who had read about this case in law school courses that had added it to their curricula before the sentencing had finished, sitting with their notebooks open, watching carefully. Bailiff James Early had been announcing judges in this courtroom for 22 years, and in that time he had said the words, "All rise," several hundred times, and the phrase had long since become for him a procedural utterance, accurate, necessary, emptied by repetition of any particular weight. But when he stepped forward that morning and prepared to speak, he found to his own mild surprise that the words had weight again, that they had recovered something they had lost through overuse. And he took a breath before he said them, which was not something he normally did. "All rise," James Early said. The Honorable Judge Diana Cole presiding. The courtroom rose, and the sound of it was the sound of chairs and bodies and intentions, all moving in the same direction at the same time, and it filled the room from the gallery to the bench and up to the high ceiling where the light fell in long, even columns through the tall windows. In the front row, Ruth Cole sat in a navy blue dress with her wooden cane resting against her knee and her hands folded in her lap, and the silver cross at her throat caught the courtroom light, the way it had caught the strobe light on Maple Street. The same object in a completely different world, and her face was carrying something that it had not been carrying on the side of that road, something that the strobe light could not have produced, and the gravel shoulder of Maple Street could not have been the setting for a mother watching her daughter rise above everything that was designed to keep her down, rise the way certain things rise, not quickly and not easily, but with a completeness that makes the difficulty of the ascent part of the meaning of the arrival. Tears ran down Ruth's face. Her hands folded in her lap were completely still. Diana walked through the chamber doors, and the robes fell around her in black formal folds, and she walked the length of the courtroom to the bench with the same posture she had maintained on the side of Maple Street chin level. Back straight, unhurried, and she placed her hands on the bench, the same hands that had been pressed flat against the cold metal roof of her own car, the same wrists that had been circled in steel. And she looked out across the courtroom, and she saw her mother, and she saw the young attorneys with their notebooks, and she sat down, and the courtroom sat with her. In the weeks after the sentencing, Diana established the Ruth Cole Fellowship, named for her mother, a thing Ruth learned about for the first time when she read about it in the Richmond Herald, and called Diana immediately to say that she had not given her permission to use her name, and Diana said she didn't need permission. And Ruth was quiet for a moment, and then said in the voice she reserved for things she had decided to accept completely, "Well, I suppose it's all right then." The fellowship offered young attorneys from underrepresented communities free legal training, courtroom access, and direct mentorship from sitting judges. The first cohort had 14 fellows, and Ruth attended the opening session and sat in the front row with peppermint candies in her purse, and called every young lawyer in the room baby, and told them they were going to change things, and the reason they believed her. Standing there looking at this 71-year-old woman with her cane and her silver cross, who had stood on a gravel shoulder with her hands raised on her birthday and had not broken, was that she was clearly someone who knew something about what it cost to change things. Chief Parks resigned within 3 weeks, not by his own initiative, but because the city council offered him a choice between resignation and termination for cause, and he chose the one that allowed him to leave with his pension intact and no statement to the press. The Whitmore Heights Police Department was placed under a federal consent decree. Body cameras on every officer, every shift, non-negotiable, and an independent civilian oversight board with actual subpoena power and a complete rebuilding of the internal affairs process from the ground up, because the old one had not been malfunctioning. It had been working exactly as certain people had designed it to work, and that design was no longer available. Pete Garza was permanently reassigned to desk duty. His cooperation factored into a decision that did not extend to absolution, because there is a difference between the man who holds the instrument and the man who watches the instrument being used and says nothing. And that difference matters, and Garza spent a long time afterward learning how much. On the wall of Diana's chambers, in a small wooden frame that Ruth had brought on the morning of the investiture and hung quietly while Diana was being photographed with colleagues, was a prayer card worn at one corner with a faint scuff across the front from where a boot had come down on it on the gravel of Maple Street. Diana had not asked her mother to bring it. Ruth had never mentioned bringing it. Diana noticed it only after everyone else had gone home, standing alone in her chambers in her robes, and she stood in front of it for a long time without moving, and then she sat down at her desk and began her first day's work. 3 months later, Pete Garza drove his personal car past the stretch of Maple Street, where the stop had happened a Tuesday evening, nothing particular drawing him there, nothing he could have explained to anyone if asked. And he pulled over at the exact spot on the gravel shoulder and put the car in park, and sat there for a long time in the dark with the engine idling, watching the oak trees and the still houses and the porch light burning steadily across the street, where Howard Eames had stood with his phone, and eventually he put the car back in drive and pulled onto the road and kept going, and he did not know what he had come there to find, and he would not know for a long time. In the federal courthouse on a Tuesday morning in November, Diana Cole called her first case in a voice that was level and clean and carried to every corner of the room, and outside the tall windows behind the bench, the oak trees on Court Street had gone entirely gold, and the leaves were coming down one at a time, slow and unhurried, the way things fall when they are finally and completely ready, and the courtroom around her was absolutely still. If this story moved you, if it made you angry or hopeful or reminded you of someone you love, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel, because there are more stories coming, and every one of them matters.